Hello everyone and welcome back to the Amoral Philosopher YouTube blog. I'm here again with my friend Dimar Zhivov. Hi Dimar, how are you?
Hi Anton, doing great.
Great, thanks again for being on the show. And this is our next episode where we discuss and continue to discuss the objections to the Kalam ontological, it's not ontological, cosmological. I think we touched upon the ontological argument last time, but we're still on the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. And last time we've addressed some of the objections to the second premise of the argument. And for the benefit of our audience, I'm just going to share the screen here momentarily so that everyone could remind themselves what the argument was. So here is basically the structure of the argument. And so far we've covered the objections against the first and the second premise. And in this episode, our idea was to deal with the interpretations of the conclusion of the argument. So to remind ourselves, the conclusion of the argument is that the physical universe was caused to exist by something else, and note that it doesn't say what that something else is. So we have to interpret that. And so the way that the proponents of the arguments, the theists, interpret the argument is to claim that that something else must have the properties that that God possesses. And this is the list of properties that are typically claimed for God. And so today we'll address these and see if someone could, even if accepting the first two premises of the argument, could object this interpretation and try to reject that something that must exist, explain the universe's existence must have this property. So does that sound like a plan, Dima, for today?
Sounds great. Let's go for it.
Right. So my suggestion is that we look at these properties in order, but perhaps some of them could be dealt with in conjunction. And looking at this, I thought maybe we could look at A, B, and C first. And so
sure.
My original problem with those was that isn't that, so on what basis are we claiming that these properties of timelessness, changelessness, and spacelessness are inferred? Are these just sort of derived from the very concept of God? Because here we clarify that this something, this entity must be timeless because it created time, changeless because it's timeless, and spaceless because it brought all space into existence. And so are these becauses that explain the properties, are they just part of the concept? And so if we accept and if we operate on this concept of God, we're due to accept those? Or is there something else, some individual argument for these properties?
Yeah, that's great. Anton, I'm not sure whether the audience can see me. I don't know, maybe we could turn off
the... I think so. Oh,
yeah, they can.
Let me try to stop sharing the screen. I think
maybe this is the best.
Yeah. Cool.
Right. So you want to discuss first the idea that the something else in question must be timeless, spaceless, and changeless. Right. So first of all, let me just I want to differentiate various stages, right? So here we are just inferring something that must be the case on the basis of the terms that we used in the argument itself, and on the basis of accepting the conclusion. Once we do conceptual analysis about what this something else has to be, given the use of the terms that we had throughout the argument consistently. So on that basis, stage two, so to say, is first to say something with respect to this something else. It will be a later stage three, which would want to relate or which would want to claim that that has some significance for theism, which has many more properties that are ascribed to God, or it has a more religiously interesting conception of God. For instance, God is said to be all-loving, and Kalam in no way favors the all-loving creator than the loving creator, than the not so loving creator. As if all one goes on, if all one has is the Kalam to think about, this cause, it might as well be a moral stinker as far as the Kalam is concerned on its own. So that's why we discussed earlier the cumulative case and so on. But, okay, so but more to your question, how did we get here in our conceptual analysis, or as you put it, interpretation of which properties this something else must have? Well, it's from the meaning of something else and the meaning of what is it that is explained causally here. What's explained causally and what is claimed to be something else from, namely what is explained, is the physical reality, the totality of physical reality, including all space, time, and matter coming into existence. So if we grant that we're dealing with something else here that brought it into existence, that we're not dealing with self-causation, and we discussed that in episode 5, the incoherence of self-causation, and that we grant the other premises that the universe, physical universe as I defined it, began to exist, then it just follows conceptually that the something else must not be the universe itself or part of the universe, because that would be the same incoherence of self-causation, or saying that the effect that emerged at some time in the past would have to pre-exist its own emergence and cause itself to come to be. That seems problematic for most thinkers. And so here the basis for us concluding that this something else has to be timeless, spaceless, and changeless just is what it is that began to exist that we're explaining causally, and that we're saying it's the something else. It's something other than the thing that was the effect. Mm-hmm. So that would be now, but I also want to say that would be, for instance, the reason why timelessness is something that's inferred here. Now, is it possible? No, let me just say this. So first of all, if you get timelessness, then on the relational view of time, where time exists because events happen, because change occurs. Mm-hmm. On that widespread view of the nature of time, changelessness follows from timelessness. So conceptually, you can't have timelessness without changelessness. So the changelessness just follows from timelessness. And spacelessness follows from the claim that by universe, we mean all space. So we either, at this point, if one wants to resist the cause of spaceless, then one has to basically go back to the argument and reevaluate the premise 2, which says that all space came to be, and say, no, maybe there was still some space over here that is eternal, in which this other thing that is spatial came to be. But that is to attack the premise 2 again. It's not to invalidate the conceptual analysis here, by which we get to the spacelessness of the cause in question.
Right.
So that would be my kind of first statement. I wonder what, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess that goes back to the discussion we had in the previous episode about whether we want to grant this property of being eternal only to God, or whether we could grant it to the universe, depending on what concept of the universe we defend, and if by our definition of universe it just includes, space, for instance, and maybe we want to say that space is eternal as well, then of course someone who defends this view of the universe could perhaps resist this interpretation. But I guess the other thought that I had was that, so you mentioned the self-causation, that thing shouldn't be taken to cause itself, but does the rejection of self-causation necessarily also makes us reject the idea that something that causes the thing may have the same property that the thing has? So for instance, can it be that, for instance, if we grant that that's something that's brought the universe into existence, perhaps that something that brought the universe into existence can be prone to change itself.
Yeah.
Right? So why would that be impossible?
Good, very good. So we have two things there that I wanted to respond one by one. The first one is, again, this idea that, well, couldn't space be eternal? Well, not if the cosmological argument goes through, not if these other philosophical reasons for thinking that the totality of physical reality came to be. In other words, those still have to be somehow reckoned with. That, again, it would just mean to go back to premise 2 and re-examine it and say, well, where did we err here? And why think that space is eternal? when cosmologists talk about, say, the Big Bang, they do not mean that there is pre-existing space in which a boom, a bang happens, and then things begin to expand in space. That would be to misunderstand what they're saying. And whatever we think about the possibility of imagining such a unique event, and to what extent our cognitive faculties are fitted for such an exercise as imagining space itself expanding, the math, the evidence suggests that space expands itself. And then if you sort of track its history in the past, you come to a point where the between any 2 points, there is no distance anymore, right? Yeah. So in other words, at least cosmologists think it's coherent to talk about the beginning of space and time itself. Right. Whatever we as laymen think about that as an idea. Right.
So I guess, so I guess just on this, I guess the layman view about space would be to picture it in terms of like geometry and have 2 or 3 axes for 3-dimensional objects, and say that, you know, space is basically these 3 axes, and whatever you put inside would occupy that space. But it's hard for us to conceive that the space itself would not exist, because if the Big Bang happened and it started with one, you know, dot of matter, or however you want to conceptualize itself, where was this dot placed? Was it like in a spaceless universe? Where is it? Where is it situated? So and that's why we get our intuitive idea that, you know, space is just infinite and it's eternal, because that's like just this 3 axes that that exist, and we placed all the existing things on. So and I guess the physical concept of what space is not in alliance with that plane.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that physicists, I think, talk coherently about the beginning of space itself. They could represent it mathematically, they could represent it even geometrically, provided you're not misled by the illustration, because there are limitations to what we can say in 2D represent to begin with. On a graph, as we put one axis and another. And so we should be always careful about any representation of physical reality, like to what extent that actually captures it and so on. But the claim, at least, is that in modern cosmology, that the space itself and physical time itself, which is measured by physical events, came to be a finite time ago. So that, I think, is the claim that cosmologists are making. Now, there was another excellent question that you had, and it's really, really deep, which is, well, hold on a second. Do you necessarily get at the point of, well, something timeless has to cause the universe? In other words, you can't also have a temporal cause that started the physical universe. And the answer is absolutely. So let me address that. The way that I think about time is I think that it's more fundamental than our physical measures of it. So I want to distinguish with Newton the physical measurement of time and time itself. For instance, one way to measure time and succession is by observing physical events happening, some changes in the outside world, outside of our mind, right? That we, you know, the clock changes its arrow, or some other event could arbitrarily be picked as that measuring device for us to say, well, more of such things happen. So change occurred and time is presupposed in that. But another way that you could create time in virtue of having events, but not have physical events. Like, I think that the succession of thoughts in our consciousness, if you just entertain with me for a second, the very possibility of the mental life being truly different from physical events. If you just go with me here, just for the sake of the illustration, we could at least conceive and speak coherently about time emerging if all you have is a mind thinking in succession. And so you're right. Does it follow indeed that physical time began to exist, that some kind of metaphysical time wasn't there prior, literally prior, temporally prior to the beginning of physical time? It doesn't. The only thing I would say, though, is that whatever that thing that would have to be temporal, right, that caused the physical time itself, what I would want to say about that is that the same argument against the actual infinites and the need for a first event, the need for finitism with respect to events, would apply here to the, let's say, mental life of that entity. In other words, the same argument, just like you said, don't have exception for whatever it is that you're postulating as the explanation, same arguments, if they hold for one, would hold, I think, for this cause, in which case it itself had to have either a cause that's timeless. So we basically shift the issue of timelessness a step before. And then the basic point is, at some point, either at the point of the creation of physical time and space and all that, or at the point of the first mental event, there would have to be timelessness at some point, and the cause having to be timeless. So that would be my response, that we're dealing here, strictly speaking, with physical time, metric time, time as measured by physical events. That necessitates a cause, right, is the claim, but that it's possible to entertain temporality, but with respect to non-physical events in the life of that being, in which case, yes, technically, metaphysical time exists, in which this physical time is then wedded, and the nature of time is more fundamental than physical, fine, but then you still have the same arguments that supposedly move you to the need for some starting point, and that's then where the cause that's timeless would have to come in. That would be my...
Right. I think that answers my question, but I think in the interest of time, we should maybe move on to the next property, if you don't mind, unless you have any other points on this one. And that's the very important one, the one that says that the thing that brought the universe into existence must be immaterial. And the because here, explaining why it must be immaterial, is because it brought all matter into existence. So I guess there are several worries with this move of immaterial thing bringing matter into existence. But before we address that, what do we mean by immaterial anyway? I think that would be the good starting point, because coming from today's background, a lot of people can say, well, aren't we all physicalists and materialists now? Are there really any immaterial thing? And if there are any, what do we mean by that? What's the concept of immateriality?
Well, it's in the name, right? It's immaterial. You're not affirming materiality. And so in that sense, the idea is parasitic on the idea of matter. And so it's saying that it's not composed of matter, it's not material. It's linguistic meaning. That's what we're saying. But then indeed, you're asking then what sort of substance is it? And so you can begin kind of then probing that. And in particular, maybe, am I right, Anton, that your worry is this? Let's say right now, ever since neuroscience emerged in all its glory, we have kind of the scientific community has moved on from the Cartesian dualism, by and large, that people do not think that human beings are composed of two separate but interconnected substances, immaterial part or substance and material part or substance. And so the question then is, if the nature of man is such that we are physical entities, and whatever properties, even if you want to postulate immaterial properties, so long as you're not postulating immaterial substance, we don't have much grounds in the empirical world, right, that we live in to sort of back the idea of an immaterial mind or immaterial entity that stands in causal relations to material events and material entities. And so is that the worry here, that we don't have this independent backing?
Right. I think that's part of the worry, that we don't have the independent backing, and we sort of have all of our science explaining everything from a material point of view. But I think the other side of the worry is that, as you rightly mentioned, the whole concept of immateriality is sort of parasitic on the concept of matter. So it's basically denying. But I wonder whether it's offering something in addition to denying for us to conceptualize what it is. Because otherwise I have sort of the same worry of a little bit ad hocness, saying that we use this concept of immateriality whenever we can't explain something. At least traditionally, you can conceptualize it being used that way. Before the science, perhaps we couldn't explain some things, and we would say, oh, it's just immaterial causes, which mean we don't know how it happens, it just happens. So is there any meats on this bones of immaterial?
Yeah. So yeah, and so here it's so important that we would be very, very careful in the way that we move here, because we need to observe the dialectical context in which we're at right now. Here's a theist arguing for the existence of an immaterial entity, mind of some sort, that brought the universe into being. In that dialectical context, if the other side...
Oh, Dima, I lost you for a second. Can you hear me? Hello?
Just a priori reject as impossible. Kind of I have independent reasons for thinking that immaterial selves can't possibly exist. Of course, Kalam is not going to be of any use, right? Because the whole idea in the Kalam is that deductively you're supposed to get via ultimately the conceptual analysis that we're still seeking for this something else. By the definitions we used, we just affirmed that all matter began to exist. We also affirmed the causal principle, supposedly in premise one. So it just follows deductively that the cause must be immaterial, however inconvenient that might be, or however unique, yet again, such a thing might be, that something immaterial stands in some causal relation. So in other words, this is offered as a kind of deductive case, and then the conceptual analysis is what you get, how you get to the materiality. So one would have to then, again, I think, go back and resist. If one still wants to say, one would either have to deny the causal principle, or one would have to deny that all matter indeed began to exist, but still reserve, like we try to do with space, some matter that then started it all off. And I want to say, but then again, it's not a beef with the conceptual analysis so much as the beef, yet again, with the evidence and reasons for affirming the first two premises.
Right.
So that's kind of the first thing I want to say. But the second is, it's open for a theist actually to contest that we are not, in our experience, aware of immaterial properties, at least standing in some interesting causal relations to what happens in the world. I think that there is something to be said about the argument that my thoughts about us having this discussion is causally relevant to me physically switching on my laptop. There's something to be said there. And if we can point to at least kind of like experience of consciousness, experience of it being relevant, what the content of our beliefs are, not just the neurological structures that are linked to that content. That's fine. That's there. But the question is, and even no substance dualist ever denied that there is an interaction that's going on between the mind and the brain. But you don't even have to go the substance dualist route to just say immateriality might be the way to think about contents of our thoughts. Immateriality would be a way of thinking about certain properties that we have. Immateriality would be a way of thinking about intentionality, that I can think of an object, you think of you, and that offness is not reducible to, identical with any brain event. Or at least that would be the claim of a number of philosophers of mind today who are not substance dualists, who want to say that. And so, in other words, I'm happy to kind of go at it and say, well, is it true that it's completely unique? But even if it is completely unique, we're arguing for a unique entity that started the whole show. And why is it wrong that we arrive deductively to a particular conclusion that all of a sudden say, no, it can't be? Then it's kind of dogmatism on the other side. Is the person open to evidence or not? That I guess would be my next question. And if one is not, then I can't help. Like that, then it would be beyond me to offer anything that's convincing.
Right. So a couple of points on this, I guess. So the first, with regard to the explanation of some of the mental causes and how dualism can help in that. Well, as we know, dualism currently, at least, is not the dominant theory in the philosophy of mind. So most probably philosophers working in the field are currently physicalists, and part of the reason for that is exactly the mind-body problem, explaining the interaction or the causal exclusion problem, which leads many to conclude that there's no really place for the mental, because all the causal relations can be explained by the physical and reduced to the physical. But leaving that point aside, and coming back to the first point where you said that it's just a matter of conceptual analysis, and if we say that all matter must have come into existence, that by definition it must have been something immaterial that brought this matter into existence, because no matter was existent at the point. So I guess my worry with that, first of all, is the same kind of worry as with the mind-body problem, and that goes back to Cartesian dualism and the problem that was pointed out to Descartes by Princess Elizabeth in 1643 or something, where she said, well, if you want to, oh, Tim, are you frozen there for a second? Are you still with us?
Yeah.
Oh,
I lost you for just a second.
Oh, yeah. So I was just going back to the original worries for Cartesian dualism that was pointed out back in 17th century by Princess Elizabeth to Descartes, when she said, well, it's all fine that you can come up with these two different substances, one of which is material, but I can't really make sense of how this immaterial thing gets into contact with the material thing to cause any changes. And I guess what I want to say is that, don't we have the same problem with the immaterial cause bringing the material world into existence? Don't we have the sort of same interaction problem as for the mind-body problem? And if so, and if what's pushing us this way is the claim that all matter must have come into existence, couldn't that be treated actually as an argument for us to deny that all matter must have come to existence? So otherwise, can we sort of turn the argument on its head and argue from the impossibility of this interaction between immaterial and material back to the claim that, it must be something wrong now or reasoning, and it must be that the matter must have existed all along?
I love it, Anton. I love it. So yes, absolutely. In other words, someone's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. You might have more reasons to deny the conclusion or to deny one of the premises coming from other arguments that you have than you do to affirm both of the premises that get you deductively to the conclusion that you are struggling with here to understand. So in principle, such a move is absolutely legitimate. I think it's relevant whether you have a knockdown proof against substance dualism. I think it's legitimate. Or indeed, it's legitimate to point to difficulties conceptually with mind-body interaction and causation there. So that's where a theist, I think, is well within his rights to then first of all say, look, notice though that this is a kind of indirect attack on the Kalam. It's not a direct attack where you're saying something is wrong with the conceptual analysis. Rather, you're saying something must be wrong with one of the premises. And so I just have to deny because I have even better reasons on the side. And so I guess my first question would be to my interlocutor is, do you have better reasons to deny substance dualism as a realistic possibility? And so, by the way, if there is an in principle knockdown argument against the possibility of something like an immaterial mind causing anything, theism goes out of the window. Then in that case, it's like almost, well, bring it. Like if there is a kind of deductive certain argument, then I guess it's futile to talk about Kalam. I guess I just don't think there is such a case. And so what I would do is just say, let's talk about those reasons that are so convincing comparably to, and compare the weight of them. And I also want to grant, Anton, that to some extent arguments are personal. To some extent, we may reasonably disagree because of our exposures to different domains of inquiry, because of our history, our intuitions and stuff. So I want to allow for that disagreement to be among reasonable people. But I, just from the dialectical point of view, at this stage, I would say, what is that case exactly? And if the person just says, if the claim is simply, I cannot conceive of it, then I guess my question would be, how strongly are you wedded to the idea that if you can't conceive of it, and again, imaginistically, or how are you trying to do that? But if you can't conceive of it, then it can't possibly be. So that's kind of, we might go back to that discussion. But another thing is just to say, well, okay. So here is the case of sort of like, okay, so here's the problem that I see with this move dialectically. It's this: are you not begging the question to seek a kind of mechanism at this point, a mechanistic explanation of how minds are related, like some intermediate relation there, series of occurrences, what have you, that is mechanistic and gets you from one to the other? In other words, it's one thing to argue that something is the case. It's another thing to argue how it is the case, to have an account, to have a mechanism or point to some kind of story of how the two are related. I think that the most that the theist can do is to point, via Kalam and other reasons, what have you, to the reality of something, not necessarily to the mechanism. And in fact, insistence from the atheist at that point of like, no, you have to have a mechanism, and unless you do, I'm rejecting it, does sound a bit dogmatic, because the idea has never been that there is a mechanism that's physical or in addition between the immaterial mind and the physical reality in causation. It is said to always be a sui generis causation, a different kind of causation, mental causation. And so here, maybe I could say, look, mental causation occurs, like my thoughts about something really has that causal effect. I don't know how they do. And finally, even if somebody says, no, but where's the mechanism? I want to say, I'm turning the tables and I'm going to say causation is flipping mysterious. If you even look about mechanical interaction, since Hume, we know at some level, we just have to affirm it. And at some level, we don't observe it. At some level, you also have to say, I don't quite know on that level how it works. And so if the pursuit of how is all of a sudden only put on the mental causation side of things and not on normal cases of event-event, physical event causation, then I want to say I think it's kind of it's not fair in a dialectic. So anyway, I threw at you a bunch of thoughts because I'm trying to be brief, but what are your objections to it and stuff?
Yeah. I don't know what to start with. I mean,
where to begin? It's like so I'm feeling like a mosquito at the nudist colony. I don't know where to begin.
Right. So I guess the problem with the like you touched upon the relation between causation and its mechanism, and I guess what the theist would like to postulate about the immaterial cause causing something material is just to say, well, this is just this case of causation. I can't explain the mechanism of how it works, but you just have to trust me. That's how it is, because it's our best explanation for how things came about.
Right. And, at some level,
someone who is a physicalist and materialist would come back and say, well, look, we deal with causation all the time. We observe, we have a lot of instances of causation. We observe these billiards balls on the table, and we know that typically how causation happens is like things have to come into contact with each other, and for that they need to be in space, and they need to have an extension for them to come into contact. And you come up with an idea of some immaterial thing which doesn't even occupy space because it's immaterial. So it's all mysterious to me how that thing can come into contact with physical things to really cause something here. You say this is a special causal
entity,
and special entity, and it's a special case of causation, which is in some ways like causation, which I see, but it's
some analogical
features. Some analogical, but if it's not the mechanism in which it's analogical to it, then I don't know how to confirm or disconfirm that it's analogical. So what's the analogy in here?
Yeah, okay.
And then if there is no analogy, then this whole thing seems again ad hoc to me. Is you just coming up with this new concept of causation that's like my causation. It claims to be analogical, but I don't see the analogy, and unless you spell it out for me, I don't want even to call this thing a causation. And if it's not a causation, why are we using this as an explanation of a physical thing coming into existence? So this is just brief thoughts. I don't know if
and so your internet, Moment, your internet or my internet has been unstable. So I was
should I repeat myself? Where
I think I heard it. I think I heard it. And if the audience did, maybe for the sake of time, I can just go ahead and offer some thoughts. And obviously, this back and forth is only beginning here. It needs way more fleshing out, which is the nature of philosophy.
Yeah.
And usually the disagreement just gets us to like a deeper intuition. Then we meet a bedrock. Like we say, look, we just differ here at this fundamental judgment level.
Yeah.
But let me just say, just in response to what you just said, my argument was threefold. Kalam deductively gets you to something that's immaterial, that caused the universe. To then say, no, I can't accept that, would have to require you to see where the flaw was, which premises to deny. And so I guess we agree that it does. And so you'd have to then choose, and so go against potentially cosmology, and so go against like the other reasons, go against all of the reasons for the finitude of the physical reality, and still say, because of this reason, I can't accept where it leads me if I were to acknowledge this premise, because I grant the conceptual analysis that it has to be material. The next thing is, what I want to say is, a theist can point to mental causation as something we experience. I think there is a kind of prejudice today. Granted, there is a prejudice. There's a kind of widespread belief that all we're dealing with is physical, all we know is physical, but there is a sense in which what's most immediate to us is our consciousness. And it has puzzled most philosophers,
which many would say
try
is
to explain
physical.
Consciousness. But the also physical, though, the majority, unless you're someone like Alex Rosenberg, who wants to say that basically, I don't believe in intentionality. I don't think our thoughts are about anything. I think all of that is an illusion, which is, by the way, self-refuting, because an illusion is an illusion of something or about something, but let that pass. Unless you're a hardcore physicalist, which says, look, all there is matter, all the properties that there are material properties, then I think people are open to mental properties. Now, the next question is, can they stand in causal relation? Here we get epiphenomenalism, where they say, no, it's just an emergent property, a byproduct, but it doesn't causally stand to anything because of the mind-body problem. Or else, indeed, like others that are panpsychists, or like others that are talking about not reductive materialism, but non-reductive materialism, emergentism of some sort. They would want to say, no, mental life is not reducible to physical. Mental events are not reducible to physical. So there are many, many positions, I think, where philosophers occupy, and not all of them, first of all, that affirm the relevance causally of mental life and mental causation, will be reductive physicalists. I do want to point to that, because I think we are, if we're not just prejudiced from the start, quite familiar in our personal experience with our consciousness, our thoughts, our private life, our inner life. And the argument, I think, can be made that those are not reducible to what happens in my brain. And so I'm prepared to go at it in terms of back and forth, but that's at least my reason for not saying, look, this is completely foreign to our experience. Right. But then I said, finally, even if this is completely unique, are we in such a case dialectically that whatever reasons I can give you to change your mind will not be strong enough to outbalance the prejudice against immaterial entities standing in causal relations? And I want to say, look, now just be brutally honest, if I were an atheist, it would still smell to me as something that's not, let's say, intellectually curious position, where it's almost like I'm making it impossible to be convinced otherwise. And I think we need to make sure we're not closing that possibility of being out-argued from our position. I certainly am open to atheism being true. I'm open to that conversation, or at least I hope to be, whatever my actual psychology is on a given moment. But that's, I think, the kind of final thought I have on this whole juncture here dialectically.
No, that's good. As you mentioned, there's a lot we can go into it in terms of philosophy of mind, but I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the next objections, because we have about 10 minutes left, because before we have
10 minutes.
Wrap up. Okay. Yes. So there are a couple other points that we wanted to look at in what concerns the interpretation of the Kalam's conclusion. So one of them, I guess, is that property E, that this entity that brought the universe into existence has to be immensely powerful. So is immensely enough here? Because usually people say that God must be omnipotent, so all-powerful. can do anything. Here, we're not making that strong of a claim. We just say
exactly.
immensely.
Immensely.
Is that good enough for a theist?
Okay, so I think that immensely powerful is not the same as omnipotent. So I completely grant the point. And it's really later, at a later stage, that you want to somehow argue from the Kalam and connect it to theism, which defines the relevant entity as omnipotent and not just immensely powerful. Now, there are some theologians that try to use the fact that it's creatio ex nihilo we're talking about, that it takes omnipotence to create something out of nothing, out of no pre-existing material matter whatsoever. But I'm not sharing that intuition. I think all it says, it's powerful enough cause to bring the universe into being. It's pretty powerful. I can't do that. I don't think anyone that, I don't think we can, but it seems, that's what we have to, basically, I want to say it has to be powerful as a cause, powerful enough, but definitely not necessarily omnipotent. But notice it's consistent with that cause also being omnipotent. It's not to negate it. It's simply to say it doesn't entail omnipotence, which is too strong of a claim. I don't think you should say, anyone should say.
Yeah. Good. I guess another thing I wanted to mention is that
I think it's not getting you all the way.
Right. So another thing on the properties is that I think you already mentioned that nothing in the conclusion entails the moral properties of the cause. So there's this gap problem existing. So we would need a different arguments to support that God is all good. So Kalam is not helping us with that. But I guess one claim that the interpretation of Kalam makes is that this cause has to be personal. Is that right? Can we infer that from the Kalam itself? And so before we go into that, what do we mean by personal? So let's start with that maybe.
Right. So, that's actually a complicated question. So hopefully I can do justice to that.
5 minutes.
So Daniel Dennett, in a famous article, talking about conception of personhood or something like that, he laid out various criteria of personhood. And it includes, for example, that the entity is rational. And then, of course, we need definition of that the entity in question is self-aware, that others are able to regard it as self-aware and as personal, that the entity is able to regard others as such. So there are kind of a number of those properties. I don't remember all of them, but I think it's enough for us to say rational, self-aware. And the question that sometimes is posed legitimately, that theists like myself would have to deal with, is, well, is that consistent with timeless entity? Like, for example, do you also have to have necessarily, as part of the essential properties of personhood, that you have to be not just capable, but in fact instantiate remembering, in fact instantiate anticipating? And it would follow from, especially God as the omni being, right, that we're supposing, from his omnipotence, from his omniscience, it follows that the concept of deliberation and period of uncertainty just doesn't apply. And so the question, I guess, that sometimes is raised is personhood compatible with timelessness? So that's one issue. I would argue it is, but I need to defend that. I don't know if we have time for that, but that's one area, right? But let's minimally just stop here. Rational, self-aware. Any thoughts on just that before we...
Right. So, self-aware, I guess we can intuitively understand what that means. So the entity must sort of acknowledge its own existence, must be aware of the fact that it exists. Rational.
Must be able to have indexical beliefs like I exist, or something like that. Right.
And rationality is also a very difficult concept, and we might disagree about what rationality consists in. But usually when we talk about human rationality, at least in the narrow sense, it's sort of reasoning in terms of means and, if you want to do something, that's the minimal concept of rationality. So the God would possess rationality, at least in this minimal sense. Is that the claim?
Yeah, acting for reasons. For reasons, right. Would be the minimal thing to say at this point.
And so rational and self-aware. So why does this cause have to possess these properties? Why is that?
Yeah, exactly. So there are three arguments that I used in the presentation. And so let's, for the sake of time, I'm just going to use two of them, right? So one argument is that suppose you granted that all the other properties, which, by the way, you asked about the inference to the personal. I think out of all the others, this is the weakest. That's not to say it's weak. It's just weaker than others. Why? Because it's not as clear, this move conceptually from, of course it must be because it's something else, to personal. I grant that. However, here's how the argument goes. Suppose you grant the other ones that I think are given through conceptual analysis quite straightforwardly by the definition of terms, having arrived at the conclusion. And then you say, well, inference to the best explanation, given that we have to find something immaterial, something spaceless, something timeless that has causal powers, what in principle could be a candidate for that? And at this point, I guess a theist would want to say, look back to our tradition, what we have always, what we've been thinking about, speculating and arguing about. We have the category of abstract entities that initially meet a number of those properties. Like number 2, for example, is spaceless, timeless. If it exists necessarily. Like there are many things that are godlike on Platonism with respect to Platonic objects, if they existed. But the problem with that as a candidate, of course, is that there is no causal power attached to number 2. It doesn't stand by definition of what we mean by abstracta. It doesn't stand in any causal relation to anything in the world. So that, I think the gap between abstract world and concrete world is way bigger than the gap between immaterial concrete objects like a mind and concrete world. And so I would want to say, we got to find some best explanation. Abstract objects don't seem to work very well, but what other candidate? And this is where a theist would say, well, hold on. I mean, there's been at least arguments in the philosophical tradition for an immaterial mind or self, and God as a concept has been around. Like, well, God would have that. God would have the requisite properties. God would fit it. And then it's open to the detractor to say, oh, hold on, but you have forgotten this other category and this other category. At this point, is like, bring it on. Like, I'm not aware of more. But if somebody is aware, it's relevant. And so let's bring it on. But it kind of leads you to sort of tentatively saying, God would fit it. It does indicate him, given how it doesn't the others that we know of. So if you're permitted to argue at this point to the inference to the best explanation way, abductively, I think it's legit then to say, hey, it does look like a person might have done it. Yeah. And then the second, do you want to stop here? Or
no,
what I think is a better reason?
So I wonder if it's a good way to understand it is that what's driving this inference to the explanation that a person must have done it. Could it be sort of some preconception of teleology or creation, things like that? Because that's what we usually deal with in life when, some objects, elaborate objects come into existence, and we think, well, there must be an entity that had a talus, or somebody must have brought that into existence. And hence the whole creationist story of how the traditional story of how not the universe, but the world, the earth and people came into existence. But then we sort of did away with it because we had a better explanation based on, evolutionary theory and Darwin, and said, well, you don't need actually any creation, any talus, it just works its way. So
I would contest that, but let's move on.
Does that undermine this whole inference to the best explanation? Can we just say that, one thing bumped into each other and the world came about, instead of like there being a personal being?
So again, remember that at this stage, there is no one thing bumping into anything, because we're dealing with no pre-existing matter in which objects bump. But so in other words, we either are here just critiquing this point, or we're critiquing some other earlier point that we were discussing. And I think we just need to be aware of what we're doing. But I would say that it's true that telos comes in, but why do we even bring personal explanation here? Because I think in a way, again, if we ask which explanations are we aware of, well, what kind of explanations do we give for the things that we do? And we give either scientific explanation in terms of laws of nature and certain regularities and causal powers of entities, or we're dealing with personal explanations in terms of telos, in terms of me wanting to talk to you. This is the final end that I was pursuing in my action of turning on the computer. Like, that explains my turning on the computer. And maybe your claim then would be, biology somehow on its own, and I would say absolutely not, but on its own biology is actually disproving for us the whole notion of teleology. And I want to say that's to confuse fields. Biology gives you an explanation in terms of how organisms develop. It does not pontificate on metaphysics. It does not rule out any deeper fundamental explanation to reality that permits emergence of life at some point, reality that set things in such a way that it would happen at some point. So it really, only if you add to evolutionary theory a metaphysical theory like naturalism, then you get to the rejection of teleology. You don't get there by science alone. So that's, I guess, what I would want to say there. But there are other reasons to actually affirm the intentionality that we're dealing with an action of a free agent. So now it's freedom, not just intentionality. And that is the third argument that I used in the presentation, which is to say basically that you essentially have the following two competing possibilities. Either the cause, the something else, is some set of necessary and sufficient conditions that are impersonal, or we're dealing with a personal condition or cause. If it is impersonal, then it's hard to see how an eternal effect would not coexist with an eternal cause. Because remember, by now we have granted, but for the sake of the argument, changelessness. So if changelessness is there with respect to the set of impersonal necessary and sufficient conditions, then its effect would follow, like emanate from it in a necessary way, right? Because we're dealing with sufficient condition. And so it becomes inexplicable why a finite time ago, the effect emerges if the cause is changeless and it's impersonal. Whereas if the cause is a free agent that has something like libertarian free will, then you could say, even though it changelessly was in one state, it acted freely. And this first action constitutes the beginning of time, constitutes the creation event, constitutes the emergence of the universe. And that's how you get to a finite effect from a changeless cause, is via personhood and libertarian free will. So that would be my final kind of...
I think that's a very, very strong response. And I think that's all we have time for today, really, because that's where we have to wrap up. But there is still the next episode dealing with objections to Kalam that's awaiting our audience. So we're looking forward to that, and we look forward to your comments or objections on any of the points that were brought up today. Again, sorry if we didn't have time to go into some of them in detail, but we had to make our priorities here.
We could continue indefinitely.
Right. Yeah,
there's potential infinite with respect to our discussion.
At least the potential infinite.
At least the potential. Only the potential.
So it remains for me to thank Dimer for coming on to the show again today, and thank our audience for watching. Thank you guys, and we'll see you soon to continue.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye all. Thank you.